This is a term that even I use casually, but we don't really think about what it means.
Yeah.
And what your piece did is you went back and you showed how the term welfare has kind of morphed to suit the demagoguery needs of Republicans.
Right.
Can you just give a background about what the term welfare means and how the media is aiding and abetting this use and misuse of the term?
Yeah. So we sometimes tend to think about welfare in terms of just like, I don't know, whatever Republicans don't like that poor people get, or whatever some Democrats don't like that poor people get. But, you know, the term and the demagoguery around the term has a very specific history that was up until 1996 associated with a very particular program, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, which was the thing that Bill Clinton ended when he said, we're ending welfare as we know it. And that was a program that had been started many, many years ago for essentially to help mostly women whose partners had died or whose husbands had left them or something like that. And it was designed as a support for women at a time when women mostly did not work. And if they did work, they did not get paid very much. And what happened with this is that as more Black women began to get access to this program, well, you know how that goes, right? The racist white people who were in charge of the government at the time didn't like this so much. And so the program began to be stigmatized in a very particular way, which was that lazy Black women, even though it was never mostly used by Black women, we should note, were basically having babies so that they could sponge off of this program. And Ronald Reagan was sort of the famous one who introduced the welfare queen into our discourse, describing a woman who, you know, was like getting $100,000 a year in government checks, which is like a thing that never happened.
Right.
But
we actually played that clip earlier in the show. It's remarkable.
Yeah. And so, you know, so this is a thing that all of this demagoguery that started in like the 60s and 70s, at the same time, we should note, as Black women were organizing for better and less punitive welfare, this snowballed until we got 1996, where even the Democratic president is running, campaigning, talking in his State of the Union about how we need to move people from welfare to work. And so in 1996, they passed a law. They ended welfare as we know it, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, because of course. And this, you know, this ended the program. It turned it into block grants. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families is now the program, with temporary being the very operative word there. It is a program designed to push poor women into low-wage jobs. That is what it is designed for. That is what it does. And so when you look at like the organizing of the Fight for 15 now and the particular workers where this started, there's a straight through line to these welfare policies, right? These were always, always, always about scapegoating a certain class of women as non-workers, as lazy, as sponging off of productive workers. And this feeds into all sorts of problems that we still have, including the fact that politicians are still recycling the same old lines about how we need to move people from welfare to work, which is what Trump said in the State of the Union, even though we don't have welfare. There is literally no one sitting around getting cash assistance anymore because we don't have welfare like this. You have a tiny group of people who are able to get some benefits for some limited period of time, and then they are forced to take whatever lousy job comes along.
Right. I mean, I think something that is so often missed is this idea, as you just said, Sarah, like there isn't this thing, this program called welfare that does things for people that, you know, as obviously a lot of people would frame it, takes money from hardworking Americans, which always means white people, and gives it to the lazy, unproductive people who don't want to work, which obviously always means either, you know, Black or brown people. But there's no actual welfare program. It's this catch-all shorthand term. Can you just tease that out a little bit for us? Explain what welfare actually is?
I mean, the thing right now, right, is that like we don't know what they mean when the Republicans say they're going to cut welfare.
Right.
Because like there's nothing. That's not a specific term. That's like me saying I want to, you know, tax people. Like, okay, who, what, where? This is not a thing, right? There's nothing called welfare that they can cut. What there is the broad welfare state, which is something that like we don't talk about as much in this country outside of academic contexts, but is basically, as my partner, who is actually an academic who studies the welfare state, put it, everything the government does that isn't kill people or spy on them or put them in jail.
Yeah, that seems about right.
But particularly programs like Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, right? Anything that you think about unemployment insurance, right? Like these are parts of the welfare state. In other countries that have reasonable actual welfare states, they have things like universal health care. And so, when you look at this, Republicans saying welfare, we need to move from welfare to work, we're going to target welfare. And when you see this laundry list, and I put like 7 or 8 of them in the article, but I could have done about 12 more of reputable publications saying Republicans to target welfare, Medicaid, Medicare spending. After push on taxes, Republicans line up welfare revamp next. GOP will tackle Medicare, Medicaid, welfare in 2018. Trump to take on welfare. Political risk looms over Republicans' welfare tinkering. These are all mainstream publications. These are not like,
Yeah, that's like Christian Science Monitor, Reuters, The Times, CNN. Yeah.
Right. The thing is, like, there is zero information there. There is no information in the word welfare. Somewhere in some of these articles, it actually says, like, well, what they actually mean is Social Security, which is what they actually mean.
Right, which is not a term people would typically associate with welfare because it's not as racialized.
Exactly. People think Social Security is the thing that they have earned and they have worked for, and they associate it with being like the opposite of welfare.
I mean, it's basically a way of leading by saying Republicans are going to cut spending for black people, so don't worry, white people.
Right.
Is really what that term means.
Right.
Exactly. This is what they're doing, and they're doing it very deliberately. And it's a dog whistle that's been primed for decades. It is designed to appeal straight to this quote unquote white working class base of Trump's, which is actually just rich people who voted for Trump, who think that there is still some population of lazy people who are getting handouts from the government. And that is going to be the way that they actually tackle programs that we all rely on.
And then the welfare is typically coupled with this other great sleazy, nebulous neoliberal term, which is reform. Which sounds very wholesome. Like there's this sort of corruption of it. It's spiraled out of control.
Exactly.
And it needs reform. When people say welfare reform, they must always mean just mindlessly gutting it, correct? Is there
I mean, right. Bill Clinton was at least honest, and he said we want to end welfare as we know it, right? And yet it was called welfare reform. And so, right. I mean, when Republicans say they want to reform something, they usually mean they want to cut the funding out of it.
Murder it.
This is true about public schools, and it's true about quote unquote welfare. It's true about Social Security. It's true about Medicaid and Medicare. Like whatever they're talking about reforming, they're talking about making sure fewer people can get it.
Right.
That's why they're on this big kick about work requirements for Medicaid now. Yeah. Because of course, a program that is the number one form of support for people who are disabled and unable to work, or people who have a disability but have some ability to work, or people who are elderly and can't take care of themselves anymore, that program needs work requirements.
Yeah, there's this punitive kind of Puritan streak to it.
Oh God, yeah.
Similar to you have to take a drug test to get government benefits. There's a racialization and a kind of condescension to it.
Oh yeah.
How much is that kind of rhetoric? I mean, reading your headlines here, these are from CNN, Reuters, Christian Science Monitor. These are not, these are not like Fox News.
No.
I was shocked, very much so, and it's hard to do that to me, just how mindless it had become, because it obviously is very racialized.
No, like I see people who are like leftists, like tweeting sort of things about this and saying welfare. And I was like, come on, guys. Yeah. Like we need to actually acknowledge that like there is nothing called welfare. Like at least in the 90s when they were talking about welfare reform, we sort of knew what they were coming for.
Right. Whereas it has a kind of positive connotation in Europe. Can you explain how those two branches of the tree divided and what the origins of that are?
I don't know the particular history about why Europeans are good at using terms like welfare state and neoliberalism, and people in the U.S. think that you're nuts and you just made up words. But right, like the welfare state is a thing that was a creature, not entirely, but largely of the post-World War II reconstruction of destroyed Europe, right? And like the English, for instance, elected a labor government after the war. They had, Winston Churchill could win the war, but then after they were like, things are pretty bad. Maybe we need somebody who believes in supporting other humans. And so this labor government is the one that created like the National Health Service. There's a family allowance in Britain, right? That where everybody gets a certain amount of money, and everybody, even the Queen, gets a certain amount of money per child. This is the kind of thing that like welfare is attacked for. This is just horrible. How could you give people money for having children? You'll just create dependency, right?
Right.
But in some countries, they realize that raising children is work and it is the reproduction of the society. And these are things that are perhaps important and maybe we want to, encourage people to do. And so the best way to encourage them to do it is make it less difficult for them to afford to. And there are many, many examples of this. But like the US never had a very strong public welfare state. Most of it, and I was just thinking about this week and put these two pieces together because I was listening to a podcast with Lane Wyndham, who has a new book called Knocking on Labor's Door. And she talks about this in the book, that the welfare state in the US is largely provided by employers. And it was provided by employers because unions made them do it. Mm-hmm. And so this has been a positive and a negative, right? Like the labor movement has occasionally at periods in American history been a little hesitant about pushing for state-provided benefits because then they're like, well, why would people join unions if they just got healthcare through the country? But in other cases, the labor movement has spent a lot of time, particularly certain unions like the National Nurses United, spent a lot of time advocating for a universal healthcare system. But anyway, what happens is that the government in the US, in the form of the National Labor Relations Act, encourages unionization. That is what the purpose of that law was back in 1935. And so that was supposed to be the sort of stick, as Wyndham puts it, to make employers bargain with their employees and give them things like health insurance. What's actually happening now is the government is doing the opposite thing. They're giving the stick to the employers by putting work requirements on, first on quote unquote welfare, now on Medicaid, to force people to take the first available job and to take away their ability to bargain. So if you have work requirements on Medicaid, like they're going to have in Kentucky and now in Indiana, what happens is that you lose your health insurance because there's a work requirement on it now. And then you have to go get a job because there's a work requirement on your Medicaid. But then you get a job and you make a little too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but you can't get insurance through your employer because your employer is McDonald's and they don't do that.
Right.
So this is what work requirements for Medicaid are actually going to do. They are going to force people to take lousy jobs that don't give them benefits.